Yes, we are on. Okay. All right, welcome back to Ask a Scientist with the Asheville Museum of Science, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Today, we're going to be learning from Dr. Katie Greenberg, who is a research ecologist with the USDA Forest Service of Southern Research Station. Oh, that's a mouthful. At Bent Creek Experimental Forest in our lovely city of Asheville, North Carolina. So Dr. Katie originally got her master's from the University of Tennessee and her doctorate from the University of Florida, but now she lives and works in Asheville, where she's focusing on developing tools that are useful for forest management. So this can include things like prescribed wildfires, regeneration of forests, some disturbances, understanding some long-term monitoring of amphibians. So she does a bunch of stuff that's really, really cool. If you're local to the Asheville area, you may be familiar with Bent Creek. It's connected to the North Carolina Arboretum right off the Blue Ridge Parkway, and it has a beautiful trail system that's open to the public for biking and running and dog walking. But yeah, feel free to send in your questions for Dr. Katie over the course of the presentation. She'll be taking them at the end, and I'm very thrilled to announce Dr. Katie Greenberg.
Thanks, Abby. So I'm a research ecologist with the USDA Forest Service at Bent Creek Experimental Forest. And I'd like to explain a little bit about how that works. The Forest Service is different from the Park Service. The U.S. Park Service are both federal agencies, but the Park Service is more focused on preservation and keeping things pretty much how they are. And they're not a multiple use kind of agency, whereas the Forest Service manages the forest so you can get some products like timber and, forest foods and hunting and things like that. You can use the forests a little bit more, but it's all sustainably managed. And the Forest Service has the branch that does the forest management. And then there's a branch that I'm in that does research. So I exclusively do research pretty much, but I try to tie it to things that forest managers would want to know to meet their management, conservation, and restoration goals. So as a group, our unit, which is part of the research part of the Forest Service, and then I'm within that, I'm part of the Southern Research Station, and within that, I'm part of Bent Creek, which is one of the research units. My unit does a lot on silvicultural methods, which is like forest management to attain restoration objectives and other goals. And what I focus on mostly, and a lot of the forestry type people do too, is trying to understand how management and natural disturbances affect plant and animal communities, like forest regeneration and things like that. There's a lot of research foresters in my unit, but I'm mostly a wildlife ecologist. So I'm going to talk mostly about that. But just a quick overview, again, we do forest response to different kinds of disturbances. I focus mostly on wildlife responses to natural and silvicultural. Silviculture means forest management, basically. And I also do a lot on forest food resources, which I probably won't talk about much because I don't really have time. I just wanted to give you an overview of some of the other things that I'm doing. And I do a lot on prescribed fire. So I'll just launch right into the idea, which is, for a long time, ecologists have known that wildlife diversity reflects diverse landscape conditions. So if you all have complete unbroken forest for, hundreds of thousands of acres, your diversity might be less than if you have a variety of different kinds of habitats interspersed within that forest. So one of the first questions when you do forest management, if you want to, at least try to think about how natural disturbances worked or how diversity worked in the past, is to think about how diverse habitat conditions did exist in our area, where it's mostly forested, and how were they created. So naturally, we have little tiny disturbances that are ongoing all the time, where just a tree dies here and there, creating a little gap. We have droughts that kill a lot of trees at a time in pulses. We have windstorms, ice storms, insect outbreaks like pine beetles. We have landslides. We have some wildlife that does some disturbances, and we have lightning ignited wildfires, which are actually pretty rare in our area. But historically, humans have always impacted the land, and they probably were one of the main things that made our landscapes diverse in the past. For at least 3,000 years, humans, Native Americans, were clearing for agriculture in villages and so on, and then they'd move and the forest would grow back up, but they'd be creating a new one using fire a lot. And in fact, way back in 1540, when European explorers were first coming through, they described a very different landscape, which, open areas and fields and so on. So over time, the landscapes changed a lot, but both natural disturbances and, even more importantly, probably humans have created diverse landscapes for thousands of years around here. So our research again looks at how these natural disturbances and human-caused disturbances affect wildlife. I do mostly wildlife. And I'm going to talk about a few different studies that together have become pieces of the puzzle, sort of, that start to show patterns of how wildlife responds to these kinds of disturbances. So just how the science is done. We do our science in the woods just like any other lab science is done. We use a scientific method. We first have hypotheses or questions. We use an experimental design, which means we have treatments. Like if we want to know how prescribed burns affect animals, we would have several different prescribed burn areas, not just one. It's called replication, where you have several of them and several that were not burned. So you have a control and you can compare the two. The reason you have more than one area that's burned and one that's not burned is it could be a weird little area that's not typical or doesn't show the average response. So if you have several of them, you can do statistics and figure out if there's really a trend for what you think you're seeing, rather than it was just some random thing where, the wildlife responded a certain way. So then we do study installation, and in field work, it's huge usually because a lot of it is a ton of work. It takes a team. A lot of this, almost all of our work is in partnership with other scientists and with the help of lots of technicians and sometimes students to help with the field work part of it. And then we gather the data, and I'm going to go into a little more when I talk about specific studies. Then we got to enter the data, do the statistics, write an article. And so it's a lot of it is not just running around in the woods, having fun. It's either hard work in the woods, or it's tedious work at your desk and at your computer. And then, of course, we like to share the results with other professionals and with people like you. So that's kind of part of the whole research cycle. So one of the first studies I did when I first arrived a long time ago was Hurricane Opal came through in 1995, and it created, it had downbursts of wind. So it wasn't like a tornado where it wiped out huge swaths of land. It created like cookie cutter areas where half the trees in these, 2-acre areas would fall and half of them would be standing. And then all around it would be intact forest. And then over here, there would be another gap. So it was literally like cookie cutters. And so we decided to see what happened in those gaps by measuring the forest structure and the wildlife. So first we did birds. We looked at 12 gaps, again, for replication, more than one area, with 12 different separated gaps and 12 controls where there wasn't any wind disturbance. And we walked slowly down these a center line through the gap or through the control. And we recorded all the birds that we heard or saw within about 25 meters of the middle. So basically we had like a 200-meter long, 50-meter wide transect where we walk for about 12 or 15 minutes, record all the birds. And that way we can get an idea of how many birds are in that particular area, like a 0.2 hectares or whatever, within that amount of time. And to do that, you got to start at dawn because that's when the birds are singing. You got to do it for breeding birds. You got to do it between around mid-May through June because that's when they're on their territories and singing. So you got to catch them when they're there and when they're detectable too, because when they're not singing, it's a lot harder to detect them. And so that's how we did those bird surveys. And just to show you briefly, you can see how you guys can see my cursor, right? So you can see how, the trees were uprooted and they fell, and there's still a lot of trees standing though. So it shows that, a lot of trees fell, but there were still plenty there. And interestingly, we saw that the dark green is the gaps. There were more breeding birds and more species of breeding birds in the gaps compared to in the controls. And of those birds, total birds, but of the individual species, some of them didn't seem to care. They were just about equally as abundant in the gaps compared to the controls. And others really cared. The Indigo Buntings, for example, this pretty bluebird, it was way more common in the gaps compared to the controls. And that's because they like open areas. You'll see them, in farm fields, as long as there's some trees to light on so they can show off. But they like these disturbed open areas. And then there's a few birds that don't like them. Ovenbirds are ground nesters, so they don't seem to respond that well when an area is cut or when there's a downburst or something like that. But if there's plenty of forest nearby, they can be there. So usually it's still not going to affect their population at a bigger level. We also looked at reptiles and amphibians in these gaps, and that is a ton of work, because the method that we use to trap them is we install these drift fences where you trench aluminum flashing into the ground, and then it meets up with these buckets. So the animal, like the frog or the lizard, comes along and says, do, 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 I'm going over here, but they can't get over there. So they walk along and they fall into the bucket. Whoops. They fall into the bucket, and then we check the trap the next day. We pick it up, we measure it, we identify it, we write it all down. That's our data collection. And then we mark it, usually by clipping a teeny piece of the toe, which doesn't hurt them, so that we know that we caught them before, because we don't want to count the same one every single. Say we have a really dumb frog that falls into the trap every day for a month. We don't want to think we got 100 frogs. We want to think that we got one frog 100 times. So we have to know that we caught it before, and that's why we mark it. So what we found in that study for these big dispersed gaps is that lizards respond very positively. They increase in these gaps because they like light. Lizards are reptiles, and they do well in warm areas, and that's probably the reason they seem to increase, or they're more active in these gaps. So we caught them a lot more. And interestingly, the amphibians, neither the frogs or the salamanders, they did not seem to care. So even though it looks like there might have been more in the control, because we did statistics and we had more than one area, we could tell that on average, there were equal or similar amounts in the gaps compared to the controls. Another study we're doing is focused on oak regeneration, which there's a problem with oak regeneration in our area. The forests they have baby trees, but the oak baby trees never seem to reach the canopy, at least in moist sites, where there's a lot of plants competing for that canopy position. So on dry sites, it's not so bad, but on productive sites, there's a lot of competition from other tree species. So we do a lot of work on oak regeneration. And this study was designed for that, where we looked at shelterwoods, burns, something called a mid-story herbicide. But we also looked at the wildlife, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So here you can see the Shelterwood Harvest and a burned area. Again, we have the drift fences in here with the pitfall traps that are closed right now, but you can still see that we can open them. And we also looked at birds. So what's interesting is in the controls, let's see, this is before we did any kind of treatment. So before and after are kind of the same in the controls, which you would expect, because we didn't do anything there. And really the only treatment that we see a big spike in birds, and this is bird density, and this is bird, the number of species, again, we see it went way up in the shelterwoods. So in this kind of habitat, a lot more birds are there, and a lot more species of birds are there, because it's open and you still have some trees that the forest, the canopy kind of birds can like, but you also have the buntings and things that like these disturbed areas. Interestingly, in the prescribed burn treatment for this study, you see we did not get any more birds or any more species of birds. It was similar to controls and similar before the burn and after the burn. And that's because the burns these low intensity prescribed burns, like the kind we have around here, don't really change the canopy cover. So all the trees are still there. Most of them don't die. So it really doesn't change much. Or if it does on the ground, like there might be some leaves burned up and there might be some shrubs killed, but they recover really quickly. So really the big thing is, are you going to kill trees and open up the canopy, the tree canopy, to make more light? We also saw something similar where in the Shelterwood Harvest, the lizards once again increased. They liked that disturbance, but they did not increase in the burns or in any of the other treatments. It was really just this yellow here where they went way up after the harvest. And salamanders in this study actually went down. I think that they don't, you would think that they don't like a lot of light and heat because they breathe through their skin. but they did decrease, but they generally come back up. And again, as I said, the surrounding forest is still there. So we're not talking about, you know, something at the population level, most likely. Another study I wanted to talk about, we're looking at fuel reductions, where people throughout our country, as you know, there's a lot of wildfires, and people are very worried about too much fuel in the forest. And they think if you can reduce the fuel, then maybe we won't have such a high risk of wildfires. In the southern Appalachians, it's not as big a deal as out west, because we really don't have nearly as much fuel buildup, and we also don't have nearly as much the ignitions. And most of our ignitions are by humans, and very few of them are by lightning, because our woods are just too moist. In general, it can happen, but it's in general. So this study, we looked at, if you take out the shrubs to reduce the fuels, what happens to the animals? And we also looked at plants, but I'm not talking about that. What happens if you do a prescribed burn? What happens if you thin the shrubs and trees out and then burn? And then what happens to a control? So we had 4 different treatments, and actually over a 16-year period, we burned 4 times in the burn treatments. So this was like a longer term kind of thing. And in the area where we first thinned the shrubs out mechanically and then burned, there was a ton of fuel lying on the forest floor for like a year before the fire was lit. So that fire was super hot compared to in the area that was just burned regular without, you know, first cutting the shrubs. That one was a lower intensity burn, but the one in the mechanical thinning plus burning was super hot, and it killed a lot of the trees. Whereas in the burn only, it didn't kill so many trees, just a few. So you can see here, this is a picture of the mechanical, the understory thinning. It killed they cut the shrubs, but they grow back really quickly. This is a picture of the burn only. Even after several burns, you see a little more light coming in. Probably some of the trees, a couple trees died, but not too much. And it recovers once again really quickly. This is after 3 burns over 16 years. We had a 4th. It doesn't look all that different from here. But in the burn that was high severity, where they thinned it first and then burned, it killed a ton of the trees because the fire was super hot. So this is almost like a shelterwood structure, the harvested area that I showed you earlier, where there's some trees standing, but most of them are down. And that's exactly where we saw the response by the wildlife, is in the high severity burn area. For this, we did point counts, where it's a little different than the strip transects I described for surveying birds. The surveyor stands in one place for 10 minutes and records everything within 50-meter radius in a circle area. And that's how they record the density and species of birds. And here again, in the area that had a lot of the trees killed, there were way more birds and there were way more species of birds. So we're beginning to see a trend here. If you reduce the canopy, whether it's by high severity burning, or whether it's by shelter woods, or whether it's by wind downbursts that are natural, you're going to see an increase in the number of birds coming in, and also the number of species coming in. We also did reptiles and amphibians in that treatment, and we found that lizards increased, and once again, amphibians didn't respond at all, but they didn't even care about the prescribed burning. We also did a study to see if it matters if you burn when the leaves are out, like during the growing season, we call it in forests, like the spring and summer, versus winter when everything, is dead above ground and dormant. And so we burned 3 areas during the winter and 3 areas during the early spring. And then we had unburned controls. Once again, we had our replicated design. And here's somebody standing next to an area that was burned in the spring, and you can see the leaf litter was decreased. But there's still a lot, and there's, the understory might have been killed low down, but there's still trees, and everything is very similar. And give it a few months, and certainly give it a year, and you're going to have a lot of greenery coming back. So these single prescribed berms don't do a whole lot for the forest structure for changing it. And once again, we used the drift fences with the pitfall traps, and we found that in this case, the forest structure wasn't very changed, as we said, because it was a low intensity prescribed burn. The only difference was the season when it was burned. And we basically found that nothing responded at all. Like, they didn't care if it was burned in the growing season or the dormant season, or if it wasn't burned at all. They were similar in abundance in all 3 of those treatments. So prescribed burning alone doesn't do much, regardless of the season, unless it affects the forest structure. Another study, we looked at the wildfires. I don't know if you guys remember the 2016 wildfires where the southern Appalachians burned. And we looked at 3 watersheds that burned, and the burns went from low severity to high severity, depending on where you were in that watershed. And we also looked at 3 unburned watersheds. And this is preliminary data. We haven't published this yet, but it looks like the number of species, which is richness, is higher in the areas that were, this is no fire and this is low severity up to high severity fire. It looks like it's increasing in the high severity burns, as you might expect based on what I just showed you, that where you kill the canopy or open it up a lot, you seem to get an influx of birds. And same thing with the abundance. This is not a done study, but it looks like they're increasing as you go up in fire severity, meaning more trees were killed. And again, all the species aren't responding the same. The red-eyed vireos don't seem to care very much. This is the no fire all the way up to high severity. Ovenbirds, I can't really tell what they're doing. They're one of the ones that generally don't like high severity disturbances. Whereas some of these disturbance dependent species are pretty much only in the high severity burns. They're not really there much where there was no fire, or even where it was medium fire, but once you get to high fire, they're there, they come in. So I wanted to show you one other study where I was looking at Shelterwood Harvest, starting right after the harvest and over time for 16 years. So as the forest grew back up from this to this over 16 years, it's actually, this is only 5 years later, we surveyed the birds, and all this again is with partners, so none of this is all by myself. And so we looked at it over time, and we also actually studied how much native fruit is produced in these stands. So we would actually go through and count how much fruit was produced in these big plots every single month. But I'm not going to talk about that unless we have time and you want to hear about it. I'm going to talk about the birds. So here's right when the Shelterwoods, right after the Shelterwood harvests occurred. And these 2 lines are basically, you know, dry forest versus moister forest, but we'll consider them as one because they're both mature forest. And these 2 are dry and moist also, but they're the Shelterwoods. So as you can see, there were more individual birds, and again here, more species of birds in the harvested areas, the Shelterwood harvest, for a long time. But as the forest grows up each year, it's getting bigger and bigger, the species start to get, it starts to look more similar between the Shelterwoods and the mature forest. And that's because the shade's coming in and the conditions aren't as suitable for these disturbance dependent species. So the disturbed condition lasts maybe 7 or 8 years around here. And after that, it's functionally pretty much the same as a mature forest in terms of how the breeding birds are responding. And as you can see here, this is how it changes over time. This is, again, only 5 or 6 years in, and by now it's even way more than that. So to take it as a whole, we see that forest canopy cover is a main driver of bird responses. If you reduce the canopy, not eliminate it completely, but reduce the number of trees, you're going to get more birds and more species of birds. But not all species respond the same. Some are disturbance dependent. Others, like ovenbirds, don't like it so much, but they recover over time as the forest grows back. Lizards also like canopy reduction, whether it's by windstorms or by, high severity fire or cutting. Salamanders don't seem to like cutting, but we didn't see a lot of change for the other kinds of disturbances. So it could be that just the highest severity. And lots of different kinds of canopy reducing disturbances can elicit that same effect that we just talked about, whether it's wind or whatever, or cutting. The birds, nothing seems to respond much to mid-story removal where you just take out the shrubs and little trees. It really has to do with the canopy, the tree canopy. Prescribed burning doesn't seem to do much unless it's high severity and reduces the canopy. And a big thing I think that's important is that open forest conditions don't last that long. That forests are dynamic, they're constantly changing. So if you cut a forest or if there's a wildfire, And you give it 10 years, it's going to be well along its way to looking like a small but regular forest, and then it grows and eventually becomes a mature forest. So we know that natural disturbances and forest management can create these open forest conditions. So bottom line, when you talk about a healthy forest, I think it's really important to talk about healthy for what? A healthy forest for an indigo bunting would be a very disturbed forest, even if it was harvested. But a healthy forest for an ovenbird might be the opposite. So really there's nothing, it's not really very meaningful to say healthy forest unless you're talking about exactly what you're targeting, for what you want to manage for or increase or whatever. And also that diverse conditions, having some areas that are open and some that aren't, will probably create the most diverse landscape level kind of communities. And that's all I have. I can talk about a couple other studies I have if you want, but I thought we should leave some time for questions. So I'll hand it over to Abby.
Sure. So we have a number of good questions for you, and we'll start with one from Katie that says, with prescribed fires, are there ways for clearing the areas of animals beforehand to make sure they're safe?
That's a really good question. Surprisingly, is your name Katie, you said?
Her name was Katie, yeah.
Okay, hi Katie, I'm Katie. Surprisingly, here at least in the Southern Appalachians, mortality of animals generally isn't very high, or at least it's not been seen to be high. You never really know what's going on. But the birds fly away, so they go somewhere else. I suppose if there were nestlings or eggs, they would be damaged by prescribed fire unless they were way up high. But if they were in the shrubs, they might. But most birds re-nest. So even if their nest is destroyed, it's probably not going to affect the population. So birds can fly away. And a lot of the other creatures go underground or into a log, or they climb up into the canopy. So generally speaking, you don't see a whole lot of mortality. But in terms of clearing the forest, I don't think that would be terribly doable.
Another is, I've heard that the Appalachians are a diversity hotspot for amphibians. What are some of the current concerns for managing and maintaining amphibian biodiversity there?
Well, I think a lot of it is salamander diversity, because one of the reasons we have so much salamander diversity, I'm not an expert in it, so I'm not a geneticist, but we have a long time ago, it was very cold down here because the glaciers never got here, but they came pretty close. So it was very cold and it pushed a lot of animals south. And then when the glaciers receded, a lot of the animals could stay, but everything warmed up, but the tops of the mountains weren't as warm, because as you go high, it's cooler. So a lot of animals got stranded on these mountaintops where it was good habitat for them, but not if they went down. So they were genetically separated. So I think a lot of them became different species or subspecies because they couldn't interbreed. And so what was the question again?
So just what are some of the concerns for maintaining the biodiversity that exists?
I think one of the biggest concerns right now is climate change, because as the climate warms, and it's not going to be the same all around the whole country. So you really have to look at what's going to happen here. But if it warms here, then the habitats that are stranded at the top of the mountain, like the spruce fir forest, the plant communities are also stranded. So if you're driving on the parkway next time, once you get to higher elevations, you'll see a very different forest type. And that forest type requires the colder, cooler climate conditions. And if it warms up, they're going to vanish because they don't have anywhere higher to go. And I think that would be the biggest concern for a lot of these animal species too. And of course, to me, urban sprawl and urbanization is a threat. Forest management, in my mind, is not that much of a threat because it happens in discrete places and not everywhere. So there's always other habitats. And it's transient, so everything's recovering. But if you make a parking lot or airport road where you have sprawl out and then sprawl goes out from that and so on and so forth, if we keep urbanizing our landscapes, that's a threat, in my opinion. That's a huge threat.
We also have another question that asks, what evidence is left behind in forests that help us see the historical human or natural disturbances on the landscape?
Well, there are scientists who do tree ring analyses where they can tell if they get a 200-year-old tree or something, they can cut a piece out of it and look where there's fire scars, because the tree, if it gets injured, might make a little scar. As long as it lives and continues to grow, it might get a little scar. So when you look at the cookie, that has the rings over time, you can tell, they can tell when there were fires, so they can piece together fire frequency that way. And then they can kind of put it in the context of, was it probably Native American? They can't really tell who started the fires or whether they were lightning or not, but they can do some inference. So that's one way. And then archaeology, I guess, might be another way.
And then one of our students just asked, have you ever come face to face with a bear?
Oh, yes. Many times. I've come face to face with a lot of things: rattlesnakes, copperheads, black bears, which scare me less than a rattlesnake because at least you can see it. In fact, this past summer, I was doing some bird surveys near Bent Creek, and I saw some movement. It was a mama bear sending her 3 cubs up a tree because she saw me. And then she stood at the base of the tree and watched me. And I started to leave just in case, because it's not safe to be around mama bears in particular. But then she decided to call her cubs down, so they rolled down the tree and went off with their mom.
Do you have any favorite stories from working in the field? Favorite wildlife to work with, or the most challenging to work with?
I like doing birds because it's to me, birds kind of, they read the book about where they're supposed to be. So like they actually, where it's disturbed, you're going to find disturbance dependent species and so on and so forth. So it's fun to sort of feel like you start to understand ecology if you start noticing birds. I highly recommend bird watching for people who want to learn the ecology. Whereas other things don't, like mice, they're everywhere, so they don't really necessarily respond to these treatments in a way that you can tell for sure that's what they're doing. But I like studying reptiles and amphibians, but it is a ton of work to put in those drift fences. Oh my gosh. So I like it all.
Is there a preference for gaps versus non-gaps based on migratory birds versus full-year Appalachian residents?
That's an interesting question. A lot of people say that gaps or little openings are important for migratory birds because there's one of the reasons a lot of these birds probably like these open areas, whether it's a gap or a small shelterwood harvest, is because the vegetation starts to grow back and it's really lush and green, and a lot of things start to flower, and that attracts the bugs, the pollinators that are pollinating the flowers, like the blueberry flowers and stuff like that. And it also attracts things that like to eat, the bugs that like to eat the leaves. So there's tons of bugs and there's tons of fruit. I can show you actually in this other study that we did, we actually counted every single fruit for every month for 10 years in these plots. In the mature forest, we found low levels of fruit, and this includes blueberries, blackberries, dogwood berries, black cherries. I mean, any kind of fruit that plants produce, whether it's trees or shrubs. Whereas in the young stands, it went up to like 19 or 20 times more fruit compared to the forest. And that's because the canopy was open, there was light, and then a lot of things come back and they flower. And a lot of pioneer species, they're called, like blackberries. When you go to pick blackberries, you look along the roadside edges where it's very disturbed, or other areas where there's no forest canopy. Those are called pioneer species. They come in after disturbances. Pokeweed, blackberries, blueberries, stuff like that. And they come into these disturbed areas, but they're not that abundant in the mature forest. So there's tons of fruit in young stands, but then over time, as it gets shaded out by year 10, it's gone back down to similar levels to the mature forest. So I think the animals are attracted by the bugs and the fruits and things like that to these areas. And they say especially it's important for migration during the fall, when a lot of things are flying and they need some energy, they might land where there's fruit and bugs and things like that.
So when you guys are analyzing your data, do you have to take into account sort of the recreational effects or disturbances? So I mentioned at the beginning that Bent Creek is used as, you know, all the time as a biking place, a place to run. Do you ever have to account for that as a disturbance in your studies?
Yeah, that's interesting. There are people who have studied the effects of recreation on wildlife. I've never done that. And a lot of my studies are not necessarily at Bent Creek. So we partner a lot with the greater national forest, and we do a lot of our studies out in the whole Pisgah National Forest or other places. We also partner a lot with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. And so like the Green River Game Lands or Cold Mountain Game Lands that are mainly managed, you know, by them and owned by them. We do a lot of our studies there. So we're not necessarily heavily impacted by recreation where we do our studies. But that is a really interesting question. There are people who've studied it. You could look some of those up probably. Oh, you're muted, I think, Abby.
Yeah, I gotcha. And this one's from my sister who we were just talking about. And she asked, what are some tips you have for a PhD student who is interested in working with the Forest Service following graduation? Are there specific skills to emphasize that might be different from getting an academic appointment?
I think actually Forest Service scientists are very similar to academic scientists in the sense of what the qualifications are. So there's different research work units. I said ours is Bent Creek is very applied and forest, in the forest type, but there's also other units that are within the research branch of the Forest Service that do genetics or that do hemlock woolly adelgid issue, which Abby told me you're doing. And they do, you know, forest pests and things like that. So I would guess, you know, probably your qualifications, if you're doing all that, would be just as good for academics and Forest Service. The key is figuring out how to get hired. And I'm not a good advisor on that, but probably if you could worm your way into working somehow as a postdoc or something with those people that you have similar research to, it's more likely they'll notice you and then want to hire you when we ever get an opening, which is not very often.
How long have you had your job and what is the biggest salamander you've seen?
The biggest salamander? Well, there's some in the rivers that are very, very big, the hellbenders and mud puppies, but I don't do aquatic stuff, so I don't see them. So maybe mine would have been like this big. And I have worked for the Forest Service now for 30 years, which is amazing because I'm only 25 years old. But somehow I have worked for 30 years. And I started out in Florida doing research. So I've also done a lot of work in the coastal plain. And then I moved up here to the Southern Appalachians.
All right, we do not have any other questions coming in right now, but do you have any last thoughts that you want to leave us with?
Not specifically, but it's a great field to be in if you like the woods and if you're willing to do a lot of hard work and you don't have an illusion that you're just going to be wandering around in the woods like you do when you're hiking, you know. But it's fun to, like, you know, be able to figure out, you know, answers to questions you have about nature and figure out ways to do it and then get it done. So I encourage you to do it if you like the woods.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Dr. Katie, for spending your morning with us. This was excellent. And we will be back next week with actually another Bent Creek researcher. So I am very excited. But thank you again for everyone that watched, and we will see you next time.